For more than 2 decades, Ed Sullivan ruled Sunday nights in America. His variety show wasn't just entertainment, it was a cultural event. He introduced Elvis Presley to screaming teens, gave the Beatles their first U.S. stage, and turned unknown singers into household names overnight. To appear on The Ed Sullivan Show was to make history. But what the public never saw was the other side of Ed Sullivan, the perfectionist, the disciplinarian, and the man who held grudges that could last a lifetime. Behind his famously stiff demeanor was a fiery personality, one that clashed with some of the biggest names in music. He demanded obedience, respect, and control, and when singers crossed him, they often paid a heavy price. Careers stalled, reputations suffered, and doors quietly slammed shut. And though Sullivan rarely spoke about his personal grudges in public, in his later years, as his health declined, he began to reflect on the artists who had angered him the most. To the shock of those closest to him, he confessed that there were 6 singers he could never forgive, 6 performers whose actions left such a bitter taste that he carried that resentment until the very end. Tonight, we're diving deep into the untold story of Ed Sullivan's secret feuds. From backstage battles to moments censored on live television, these are the stars who managed to charm America but infuriated the man who gave them their stage. And when you hear the names on Sullivan's list, you may be shocked to learn just how personal and how ugly these rivalries truly were. When television was still in its infancy, one man rose above the rest to become its most powerful tastemaker. Ed Sullivan, a former newspaper columnist with little charisma and a famously stiff stage presence, somehow built the most influential variety show in America. The Ed Sullivan Show, which ran from 1948 to 1971, was not just another program. It was the gateway to fame. For more than 2 decades, if you wanted to break into the American mainstream, you had to go through Ed Sullivan. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't charming in the way most hosts were expected to be. In fact, critics mocked his awkward delivery and wooden gestures. Yet what Sullivan lacked in style, he made up for in authority. Week after week, millions of families tuned in, trusting him to decide who was worth watching. His word was as good as a king's decree. If Sullivan liked you, your career soared. If he didn't, you could be forgotten before your first record even had a chance. That extraordinary power meant Sullivan wasn't just a host, he was a gatekeeper. Elvis Presley's swiveling hips, the Beatles' mop-top haircuts, and the Supremes' dazzling harmonies all found their American stage on Sullivan's show. A single performance could launch record sales into the stratosphere. Careers were made in those crucial 10 minutes of airtime. But Sullivan also understood the weight of his influence, and he guarded his stage with a strict set of rules. Singers were expected to follow his instructions without question. Lyrics had to be approved, costumes had to be deemed appropriate, and any whiff of controversy was carefully policed. Sullivan prided himself on being the man who brought family-friendly entertainment into American living rooms. That meant he tolerated no rebellion, no deviation, and certainly no disrespect. But not every singer was willing to play by those rules. And that's where the cracks in Sullivan's calm exterior began to show. Behind the camera, he was known to be temperamental, quick to anger, and deeply sensitive to slights, whether real or imagined. A missed rehearsal, a snide remark, or even a refusal to compromise could put a star on Sullivan's bad side permanently. Those who worked with him often described him as a paradox, outwardly polite, even shy, but capable of explosive fury when he felt undermined. One stagehand later recalled that Sullivan's glare alone was enough to silence a room. Others said he could hold grudges for years, quietly making sure that performers who crossed him never appeared on his stage again. This darker side of Sullivan rarely reached the public. To viewers, he was the calm, steady master of ceremonies. But in the insular world of television production, singers whispered about his wrath. Some stars left his stage with bruised egos, while others found themselves effectively blacklisted from one of the most powerful platforms in entertainment. And yet, It was this very power that kept artists returning, even if they disliked him. The stakes were simply too high. For a young singer, landing a spot on the Ed Sullivan Show meant instant validation. Sullivan's approval could turn an unknown act into a sensation overnight. Even established stars needed him, because as long as Sullivan's show remained the cultural centerpiece of American Sundays, his influence was inescapable. As the 1950s gave way to the 1960s, the musical landscape began to shift. Rock and roll was challenging traditional values, civil rights movements were demanding space on television, and performers were pushing boundaries like never before. Sullivan, determined to maintain control, often clashed with the very artists who symbolized this cultural revolution. Some of those battles ended in compromise. Others ended in bitterness. It was in these moments, backstage arguments, heated rehearsals, and last-minute showdowns, that Sullivan's true feelings toward certain singers emerged. While he kept most of his grudges private, those who worked closely with him knew he had a mental list of artists he despised. To him, it wasn't simply about a bad performance. It was about respect. If he felt disrespected, he could never let it go. That is why, in his later years, when Sullivan began reflecting on his long career, he shocked those around him by finally naming names. Quietly, almost as though releasing a burden he had carried too long, he revealed the 6 singers who had angered him so deeply that he carried the resentment to his grave. For decades, fans only saw the polished Sunday night spectacle. But beneath the surface, Sullivan's feuds with some of music's biggest stars were simmering, shaping not just his legacy, but the careers of those who dared to defy him. And in the chapters to come, we'll uncover who those singers were, what they did to spark Sullivan's anger, and why, even after decades of success, he never forgave them. Because while Ed Sullivan gave America unforgettable music moments, he also held on to bitterness that revealed a far more complicated man than the smiling host on television. Ed Sullivan's television empire thrived on appearances of unity, respect, and family entertainment. But behind the curtain, things weren't always so harmonious. As music changed in the late 1950s and early 1960s, so too did Sullivan's guest list. Rock and roll was no longer a fad. It was the sound of a generation. But with its arrival, came young performers who weren't interested in bowing to Sullivan's rules. And those who pushed back found themselves face to face with his infamous temper. The first cracks showed with a man whose career Sullivan himself had helped ignite, Elvis Presley. When Presley was booked on the Ed Sullivan Show in 1956, the I-1 performance became one of the most watched events in television history. Over 60 million Americans tuned in, cementing Presley as the king of rock and roll. But what fans didn't know was that Sullivan had not initially wanted Elvis on his stage. He considered Presley vulgar, inappropriate, and dangerous for American youth. CBS executives eventually convinced Sullivan to give Elvis a chance, but he imposed strict conditions. Presley was told to tone down his movements, and the cameras famously shot him from the waist up to avoid broadcasting his swiveling hips. To viewers, the decision became a pop culture landmark. To Sullivan, however, it was a compromise he resented. Privately, he told colleagues that Elvis embarrassed him. Though he invited Presley back for more appearances, he never forgave the singer for pushing boundaries he felt crossed into indecency. Decades later, Sullivan admitted that Presley was one of the performers he simply could not respect, and one of the 6 he would carry bitterness toward for life. The second feud was less about morality and more about control, and it involved Bo Diddley, the pioneering rhythm and blues artist. In 1955, Bo Diddley was invited to perform on Sullivan's stage, a rare opportunity for a black musician at the time. Sullivan had instructed him to sing 16 Tons, a hit by Tennessee Ernie Ford. But when the cameras rolled, Diddley instead launched into his own self-titled song, Bo Diddley. The performance electrified the audience, but Sullivan was livid. He viewed the act as outright defiance and a personal betrayal. After the show, Sullivan berated Diddley backstage, accusing him of deliberately embarrassing him on live television. In retaliation, Sullivan banned Bo Diddley from ever appearing on his program again. To Sullivan, the incident wasn't just about a song choice, it was about authority. By disregarding his instructions, Diddley had challenged Sullivan's control, and that was something he would never forgive. These two early conflicts reveal the essence of Sullivan's grudges. With Presley, it was about cultural values. With Diddley, it was about obedience. In both cases, Sullivan believed that his authority had been undermined, and once that line was crossed, reconciliation was impossible. But what made Sullivan's grudges particularly powerful was that they weren't just personal, they were professional. His show was the single most influential platform in American entertainment. If you weren't on the Ed Sullivan Show, your chances of reaching the mainstream shrank dramatically. To be banned, or to fall from his favor, was a serious blow to any performer's career. Elvis, of course, survived and thrived. His fame became unstoppable, with or without Sullivan's approval. But for Bo Diddley, being blacklisted meant a loss of exposure that could have pushed his career even further into the mainstream. The ban became a bitter reminder of the obstacles black musicians faced, in an industry still dominated by white gatekeepers. Ironically, Sullivan often prided himself on being progressive when it came to race. He booked Motown acts like the Supremes, the Temptations, and the Jackson 5, giving black performers visibility at a time when few television hosts dared to do so. Yet when it came to personal defiance, Sullivan's temper knew no bounds. Race, fame, or talent didn't matter. If you embarrassed him, you were finished. Colleagues described these feuds as almost obsessive. Sullivan could hold on to slights for decades, replaying them in his mind long after the performers themselves had moved on. By the end of his career, as his health declined and he began reflecting on his life, Sullivan shocked those around him by naming Elvis Presley and Bo Diddley among the 6 singers he hated most. For fans, it was jarring to hear. These were artists who helped define the cultural revolution of the mid-20th century, performers whose names were etched into the history books. Yet for Sullivan, they were reminders of moments when he felt powerless. And for a man who built his empire on control, that was unforgivable. These were just the first 2 names on Sullivan's infamous list. But they set the tone for the others who followed. Singers who crossed him, who ignored his rules, or who represented cultural changes he couldn't accept. Because while Sullivan's show gave America some of its most unforgettable music moments, it also revealed a host whose thin skin and iron grip left scars on his relationships with the very artists he helped make famous. And as we move forward, we'll uncover the next names on that list, singers who tested Sullivan's patience and paid the price for it. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, Ed Sullivan had already made a name for himself as the man who brought America its Sunday night entertainment. But while he had an eye for talent, Sullivan also had an ear for trouble, and when it came to rock and roll, he wasn't shy about making enemies. The genre itself was exploding across the country. Young people adored it. But to Sullivan, a man raised in a far more traditional era, it was loud, unpolished, and often scandalous. He viewed rock not just as music, but as a cultural movement that threatened the conservative values he believed television should uphold. And so, some of the biggest names in music soon found themselves at odds with the host who could make or break a career. One of the earliest clashes came with Buddy Holly. When Holly and the Crickets were invited on the show, Sullivan reportedly took issue with their song choice. Holly refused to compromise, wanting to perform his way. This act of defiance infuriated Sullivan, who attempted to sabotage their performance by lowering the volume of Holly's guitar microphone. The result was a tense, visibly uncomfortable performance, and afterward, Holly was quietly blacklisted from ever returning to the show. Another story unfolded with Bo Diddley. Scheduled to perform one of his hit songs, Diddley instead launched into a different tune once the cameras were rolling. To Sullivan, this wasn't just rebellion, it was outright betrayal. After the show, Sullivan unleashed his fury backstage, swearing Bo Diddley would never again appear on his stage. True to his word, the musician's name was permanently erased from the show's future lineups. But perhaps the most famous feud involved the Doors. When Jim Morrison and his band appeared on the show in 1967, they were asked to change a lyric from their hit, Light My Fire. The line, "Girl, we couldn't get much higher," was considered too suggestive for television. The band agreed before the show, but once the cameras rolled, Morrison belted out the original line without hesitation. The defiance shocked Sullivan, who was enraged not only at Morrison's boldness, but at the national embarrassment it caused. Backstage, Sullivan reportedly told the Doors they would never perform on his show again. Morrison's cool response, "Hey man, we just did the Eddie Sullivan Show." These moments weren't just isolated clashes. They revealed a deeper truth about Sullivan's relationship with rock and roll. He wanted its energy and its ratings, but he despised the unpredictability that came with it. To him, artists who challenged authority were not just difficult, they were dangerous. And so, his grudges against figures like Holly, Diddley, and Morrison became legendary, marking them among the select group of performers Sullivan truly hated. For Sullivan, control was everything. But for the rebels of rock, freedom was the heart of their music. This clash of values ensured that whenever a rocker walked onto Sullivan's stage, sparks, and sometimes outright fireworks, were bound to follow. By the late 1960s, Ed Sullivan had become more than a television host. He was an institution. His Sunday night show was the place where stars were born, but it was also a stage where reputations could be destroyed with a single bad interaction. For all of the artists Sullivan welcomed, there were those who ended up on his bad side permanently. These weren't just minor disputes. They were moments so explosive that they etched themselves into television history. One of the most infamous feuds was with Elvis Presley. Ironically, Elvis's early appearances on Sullivan's show in the mid-1950s are what helped launch him into superstardom. The ratings were astronomical, with millions tuning in to see the king of rock and roll. But Sullivan himself was not a fan. He viewed Elvis's hip-shaking performances as vulgar, even dangerous. By Elvis's third appearance, Sullivan had cameras shoot him only from the waist up, an attempt to censor the provocative movements that drove young fans wild. Behind the scenes, Sullivan dismissed Elvis as nothing more than a fad and resented the way Presley overshadowed him on his own stage. Although he tolerated Elvis for the ratings, he privately admitted he hated the cultural frenzy Presley represented. Then there was Frank Sinatra. While Sinatra had been a guest earlier in his career, Sullivan reportedly found him arrogant and demanding. Their personalities clashed. Sinatra, the cocky crooner who lived life on his own terms, versus Sullivan, the strict gatekeeper of Sunday night decency. According to crew members, Sullivan resented Sinatra's unwillingness to play by his rules. Their relationship soured to the point where Sinatra avoided Sullivan's stage entirely in later years, preferring to work with producers who gave him more freedom. Another bitter chapter involved Jackie Mason, a comedian whose career was nearly destroyed by Sullivan's fury. During a live broadcast, Sullivan mistakenly believed Mason had made an obscene hand gesture toward him after being given a wrap-it-up signal. Outraged, Sullivan banned him from the show and publicly shamed him in the press. Though Mason tried to explain it as a misunderstanding, the damage was done. His career stalled for years, and he later admitted that Sullivan's grudge almost ended his livelihood. And then there was the unforgettable clash with the Rolling Stones. When Mick Jagger and the band were booked in the mid-1960s, Sullivan demanded they change the lyrics to "Let's spend the night together" to something less suggestive. Unlike Morrison of the Doors, Jagger begrudgingly complied, at least partially. He rolled his eyes dramatically on camera while singing the altered line, making it clear to the audience that the censorship was forced. The stunt infuriated Sullivan, who saw it as mockery. Though the Stones returned to the show in later years, Sullivan never forgave the moment when they undercut his authority on live television. By the time Sullivan passed away in 1974, his grudges were well known in Hollywood and the music industry. For every star he adored, there were others who walked away muttering his name with disdain. His power to elevate careers was unparalleled, but so too was his willingness to blacklist those who crossed him. For Sullivan, loyalty and respect mattered more than fame, and anyone who dared to defy him found themselves permanently on his list of hated performers. In the end, Ed Sullivan's complicated legacy wasn't just about the stars he introduced to America. It was also about the ones he despised. Elvis, Sinatra, Jackie Mason, The Doors, the Rolling Stones. These weren't just entertainers. They were reminders that even the most powerful man on television couldn't control everything. And sometimes, in trying to hold on to that control, Sullivan revealed more about himself than about the artists he loathed.